So here's the continuation of the past video that talks about the optimization of firewall. So this time I'm going to be a little bit more relaxed and talk a little bit more in depth regarding what you can actually do with this spell and how to really make it work with the other subclasses, with the other race, with some of the best feats in the game, etc. But to preface, I believe there are a lot more spells in the game that actually does fire damage. And there are similar spells in the game who is efficacious and do a lot of damage at this level. So also I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison to see why Fireball is better at some cases and why it is not as desirable or optimized in other cases. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin. So let's first take a look at what the Fireball spell actually does overall. So it is a ball of fire with a 20-meter radius, and it blasts the enemies doing 8d6 damage on each character and half on a successful dex save. So that is the gist of the spell. Now, I think the first thing to really cater is the main weakness of the spell. So this spell is fire. Fire is something that is commonly resisted in the game, only comparable with poison and ice. So you're going to expect a lot of enemies to be resistant or even outright immune to this spell. So for example, fiends, for example, elementals, even some celestials. If you see these creatures, don't cast Fireball. But if you see stuff like plants, then these are the best targets for you to blast upon. And also remember that this spell is best when it is used against a huge number of enemies with low hit points. So everything about Action Economy is about making sure you have more stuff to do than your enemies and making sure that your spell is the most effective. So I'm going to give you a comparison first. Imagine casting Fireball versus casting poison related concentration spell. For example, Cloud Kill. So immediately you're seeing more damage with Fireball because of the 8d6 damage. But Cloud Kill, a spell 2 levels higher, is going to do much more damages on a longer span of time. That is because that spell has 10 minutes of concentration, and every round it is doing respectable damage, around 20 on average on each enemy. So if you are comparing Fireball to a spell like that, then you are far from being the highest damage output in the game. Remember this, and the other comparison is Fireball versus the Synthetic Static spell at level 5 as well, which do exactly the same damage. But Synthetic Static gives you basically an intelligence saving throw. It gives you psychic damage. And after the damage, it gives you the ability to debuff for 1 minute. Not going to go too much into the spell, but that is basically the comparison. And the first spell to compare with is the level 3 Erupting Earth. So this is, to me, a really underrated spell. So this spell basically does 3d 12 damage, if I remember correctly. And this spell do the same saving throw and half damage against the enemies, except it creates some ripples after activating, and the area becomes difficult terrain, same range and same radius, by the way. And those ripples has to require 1 minute to clean, which means that if you are in a combat, your enemies are not going to clear the ripples at all. Like, this is not something that can happen within the battle most of the time. So the reason I want to list these 3 advantages for the other spells over Fireball is to show you that Fireball is not the only way to affect the battlefield. In fact, Fireball is not even the best way to do the most damage, to have the best type or saving throw, or has the best control effect to combo with other spells. For example, Erupting Earth. As I mentioned, it creates a difficult terrain, so it pairs perfectly with spells that have debilitating control effect, but doesn't have difficult terrain. For example, the same level you get Stinking Cloud or Wall of Fire on level higher, which is also fire damage, by the way. So when you use Fireball, you have to be very careful what you're doing. The biggest advantage here, number one, do not upcast this spell. Stay at level 3, because at level 3, its damage is unparalleled. Number 2, the range and the saving throw is decent, and it has a huge casting range. So use this spell at the enemies when you are sure that they will die because of your spell. And of course, there are also ways to make the Fireball more optimized. I'm going to tell you regarding the damage type now. So number one, take the Elemental Adept feats if you have the space to do it. It allows you to bypass resistances, which is a huge problem for fire anyway. But to my knowledge, like you don't really have that much freedom to take a feat like Elemental Adept. Usually you're going to take a feat for Warcaster first, and you're going to argue Alert, Lucky, Resilience, etc. So again, great feat, but I'm not sure how much you can actually use it. Another way is to look at the famous Evocation Wizard, which number one allows you to avoid friendly fire within Fireball range. And when you go higher, you will realize that the Fireball damage can be maximized once per day without penalties. So I think the level 10 ability and the level 14 ability of Evocation Wizard, you can take a look. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Basically, you have some intelligence plus damage and maximized damage. So that is very synergetic with Fireball, given that its biggest advantage is how much damage it can do. And aside from Wizard, which by the way, it is great, but I just think that Sculpt spells who can help you bypass damage to your friends is actually more valuable the more you use it. I mean, this is the spell that allows you to avoid another big problem with similar evocation type spells, which is basically friendly fire. So this is something that is very hard to position without hitting your allies. And another wizard subclass that works extremely well is the Order of Scribes wizard. So what it does is to give you another damage type at the same level. If you choose another spell, you can switch the damage type. So for example, you are looking at the lightning bolt. It gives you lightning damage instead of fire damage, so you can actually inter-exchange. And this is very good for Fireball because it gives you a lot more freedom to choose what kind of damage you want to do. And I'm going to skim through this because immediately you're looking at another subclass, actually another entire class that has such a great synergy with the Fireball spell, and that is the Sorcerer subclass. So when it comes to the Sorcerer subclass, immediately you will look at the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer. And the Draconic Bloodline gives you similar perks as well. Number one, you get some minor damage buff from your subclass ability on fire to your lineage. Number two, you are looking at the ability more of the sorcerer itself, which is to buff your damage via empowered meta magic. And it is a more accessible economic choice because for the wizard you have to wait until level 10 and 14. For the sorcerer you just have to wait until level 3. But here's the trap, because you can do a lot with that one sorcery point to instead subtle cast counterspell, or to twin, for example, if you have a way to access it, Tasha's Hideous Laughter. So for Fireball, what you want to do is to do this damage on a huge number of enemies, and you have to reroll a lot of ones. Then in terms of the numbers, you're going to see a lot of use. And of course, the Draconic Soul also allows you to have the ability to get resistance. But I don't think that is too useful in actual gameplay from my experience. And next up, you are looking at one of the newer options for meta magic, which is the Transmute spell option, which allows you to again change your damage type. And I think this is actually the superior option because you have a lot more types to choose. As I mentioned, Ice, poison, I think thunder, lightning. You have a lot of choices here to change, which makes your fireball, again, very versatile without having to use too much resource for your spell. So I think, like, overall, I would prefer having the sorcerer to maximizing fireball. But I would say that the wizard is still a really great option. So after talking about this, because if you compare to the other subclass, I think the wizard and sorcerer is going to have the most synergy. And for the other, I'm just gonna have a mention about what you can get, or rather how you can get fireball. And for a warlock, it's usually the fiend warlock, or you can also take the genie warlock with the fire patron. And actually for the genie warlock, you can allow your eldritch blast to get some extra fire damage, and you can get elemental resistance at level 6. So that is pretty good in order to use fireball in conjunction. And the druid doesn't really have a lot of synergy. The wildfire druid should have this spell. I don't know why they don't give it the fireball spell, but still, the moon druid is actually very interesting, because if you transform into a fire elemental and your party members have any way to use fireball, you can actually, as a fire elemental, go into the battlefield and grapple one of the biggest enemies, or one of the enemies you want to die, you want to hit and dead, and cast fireball, because you are immune to fire as a wild shape. And although I do not recommend, sometimes you can use the web spell or the slow spell. Both gives you the ability to either burn the web or to have an advantage when it comes to the dexterity save. And as a result, you will see that, especially, I have to say again, the web spell is not optimized when you burn it. Usually it is great at restraining. But you can look at situations where a huge number of enemies, number one, you want them to be held in the same place. And number two, you're going to see that in 1 to 2 turns, they will escape the web. So it actually buffs the damage to fireball by quite a sizable margin. And as a druid, you are more of the person who are doing spells to help with holding your enemies in place. Again, as I mentioned, the Erupting Earth, Transmute Rock spells can hold your enemies in place to blast a fireball, which is very helpful, I would say. And we look at the cleric, and you see immediately the light cleric. So I would say that the light cleric doesn't have much of a advantage when it comes to using fireball, other than having it. But the light cleric itself does have some synergy. So for example, its level 17 ability basically gives you the ability to buff the fireball saving throw against enemies when they are under the effect of your sunlight. Again, not going to go too much into it in this video, but that is a great ability to make your fireball hit more accurately. And the light cleric itself is a medium armor yielding class. So you have more capability to actually go closer to the front side, casting this spell. And you have more survivability overall. And let's say if you kill your allies, you can use a healing word to bring them back up next turn. This is not optimized, by the way, but if it is the way you want to do it, if you want to blast your enemies, some people say, oh, use Empower spell, or oh, use the Evocation Sculpt spell. But I say kill your enemies and your ally, and you bring them back up later. So yeah, that is an option, actually. So for the bard, you want to take this as a magical secret, but seriously, don't take it as a magical secret. You have a lot more options that is favorable to you, so just don't do it. They don't have a lot of synergy, and magical secrets are really good, but they are also limited in number of magical secrets, so don't do it. Yeah. And first, I remember the half caster doesn't have it, so I'm not gonna mention too much about it. But for the marshals, I think the monk and the druid martial subclasses and classes that works really well with a caster who has Fireball because of the ability to use evasion, which means that they can basically jump away from the damage of the Fireball itself, and they're gonna be fine. So when you are having a party composition and your martials are these two classes, you will be able to basically use Fireball to blast more safely. And of course, by the way, it is a dex save, so when you see enemies that are probably smaller and they are usually like have a huge flying speed, etc., those are the kind of race or class or subclass that have the ability to survive a Fireball. So do it more on enemies who you are sure have a low dex save. Like if there's a huge bumbling monster out there, then yeah, that is a good option. So this is as far as I can remember regarding the synergy with classes and with subclasses. In terms of the race, you are able to take race with the ability to resist Fireball naturally, such as most famously the Tiefling race and sub-race. And there are ways to set up your Fireball, but there are actually a more underrated combination, which is to have the ability to either fly. Yeah, so you want to be able to target your Fireball at any enemy at any distance at any time. So mobility guarantees you to have the power to get into range. So for example, if you are able to play the Aarakocra race, which gives you, for the original version, like 50 feet of flying movement, that means that number one, you are able to fly closer to your ground enemies. And number two, if there are like other flying races up in the sky, you can just fly up a little bit and blast the Fireball. Remember that using Fireball in the air is also great. Like this is a great use of a spell to blast a bunch of like eagles or a bunch of little flying creatures on the air. So I think having this option to get extra movement in order to guarantee a hit is really helpful overall. Yep. And in terms of the race options, I don't think it is too prominent. And this is unlike another commonly resisted damage type, which is poison, because for some reason there is an extremely broken combination of using poison and having the ability to be immune to poison. But I'm not going to say here. I'm going to say in the next video I do. So anyway, fire related race are more like either synergy or like some ribbon feature. I don't really have too much of a recommendation. So usually for this case, just take human variant to get elemental adapt if you want to have the ability to universally cast Fireball as it is. As for the backgrounds, you don't really have too many ways to get Fireball, even with the new backgrounds to get expanded spell list. And that is a design choice because this spell is so iconic, especially on a wizard. So don't really consider using a background to get it. But it is a good spell to have and worth getting the class they use because like sorcerers and wizards are really powerful. And all the subclasses I mentioned before, they are also really good. So yeah, that is the overall synergy to get with Fireball. As of right now, I don't really have a lot of addition. I think stuff like items are going to have more synergy as well, but that is another topic. But I hope for today's video, it helps you to really optimize Fireball more. And just a small recap overall for the video since I can see that it's getting a little bit long. So Fireball has the ability to cast from a huge distance. It has a huge radius and it does a lot of damage for its level. It's not the best blasting spell to upcast. It doesn't have the best damage type. And in terms of synergy, you have the ability to either change its damage type or the ability to maximize the kind of damage you can do with features like the Empower Meta Magic or the Evocation Wizard, etc. So I won't say that Fireball is the one with the most abuse in terms of synergy with either relative subclasses or race, but it is absolutely one of the most reliable spells out there you can use. So you can argue that this spell is the only spell you need for a day-to-day campaign. You can blast the forest, you can kill a bunch of enemies in the dark. You have the ability to cast Fireball to reveal hidden creatures, to burn evidence. By the way, remember that Fireball can burn things and leave them on fire, so this is a great utility and to use with your other spells. And yeah, that's it. So have fun blasting, have fun using this spell. Don't use this spell when you know that it can go extinguish, like the Slate Storm spell being cast on top and your Fireball just poof and extinguish. So yeah, that is a interesting sight to see. And yeah, have fun using this spell. I'm sure that Fireball will yield you great results. I think the consistency and the high damage and the guaranteed reward, as well as the satisfaction to just killing a bunch of enemies on sight, is really what Fireball is about. And this spell is really quite strong for its level. So whatever you do, you will be fine. So yeah, take this spell and do whatever you want. And I will see you in the next video.